In order to save my brain cells, the weekly genocide that is reviewing RWBY, I'm going to finally talk about something I've wanted to cover for a while. And perhaps more important to my own sanity, something that is pretty damn good. Dare I even say underrated in what I consider to be my favorite horror movie, Pumpkinhead. The film opens up with the family sitting around a table before cutting to a man running from something. He begins begging for the family to let him in, saying he didn't kill that girl. The man then runs off again after being threatened and is brutally murdered by Pumpkinhead. This opening scene is very effective at establishing several things that I'll go into a bit later. The presentation is also pretty good as well, managing to use the nighttime colors to establish a chilling mood, along with some great sound design. Flash forward 30 years, and the boy has grown up into Lance Hendrickson, who plays Ed Harley, currently using a Chekhov's gun. Kinda. He has a son of his own named Billy. Obviously, the lack of the mom shows that she's dead. And isn't this family just so happy? I'm sure nothing bad will happen to them at all. That aside, it is effective in establishing Ed's motivation later on, which is pretty obvious, I'll grant you, but you'd be surprised how basic things like this have been seemingly lost in Western storytelling. We are then introduced to the other characters who are heading to a cabin for a nice getaway. And immediately we know who's going to kick the plot into motion.
Honey, get me a beer.
No, not because he's drinking and driving, but because his name is Joel. And we all know every death is his fault.
Literally every death that happens after the first game is Joel's fault.
These characters, while nothing to really write home about, are serviceable for what they're supposed to be. And it's also nice to see that they're not made into the worst people imaginable, which defeats the purpose of horror as it robs tension when the characters are in danger and thus makes us not fear for their safety. Then again, that's not relegated to just horror, but it's retarded either way. Ed and Billy arrive at their store and we get some more father-son bonding. Joel and the gang arrive and Joel decides to do some dirt biking. Gee, I wonder what's going to happen. Nothing terrible, I hope. Some mountain folk pull in and we get some nice world building and setup. One of these kids decides to take a baseball. The oldest brother, Bunt, then begins to taunt his brother about the local legend of Pumpkinhead. When the kids begin reciting the poem the film was very loosely based off of, it causes Ed to have a flashback to the opening scene, establishing that he at least somewhat still remembers what happened. The grandfather of the kids asks for his feed, but Ed forgot it at home. Why he doesn't take Billy with him, I'm not sure. You could make the argument that because they're so isolated, the chances are low that anyone would try and break in. However, there are a bunch of strangers outside dirt biking, though they haven't really shown hostility. Even Joel, who only made fun of Billy's glasses. It is also established that it would have taken only a few minutes, and afterwards both would have dropped off the feed. So while one could argue it's a small contrivance, it isn't enough to significantly harm anything. Gypsy runs out of the store and Billy chases after him like a stupid child would do. Well, I'd probably do the same thing because I wouldn't want my doggo to be harmed either. Maggie chases after Billy and shock of shocks, Joel runs him over. Fucking Joel, ruining everything. Everyone is of course freaking out because a kid was pretty much killed. Joel decides to bolt, however he has his reasons just besides from being a dick.
It was an accident, I almost hit him myself. Yeah, but I've been drinking. They'll fry me.
How much, we're not really sure because we only saw him drink the one beer, but it makes more sense with some new information we get later in the film. And because there's no phone in the shop, they can't call an ambulance, which is odd. I understand that Ed and the Mountain Folk are pretty behind in terms of technology, but it's rather strange that they wouldn't at least have a phone. At the very least, there's an in-universe explanation for it. The group decides to go to the cabin and use the phone there, while Steve stays with Billy. The location of where everything takes place is unclear. I always thought it was the Ozarks, but apparently not. I bring this up because there are phone lines, and I understand that the film wants a reason as to why they just can't call an ambulance, but the fact that they're in a very isolated region would have been enough. Simply have the ambulance not make it in time. Having a phone wouldn't go against the isolated feel at all, but I digress. Ed arrives back at the store to find his son a mangled mess. Naturally, he's very upset.
Can I help?
Tracy gets on the phone, but of course Joel pulls the wire. If she were a zebra, I bet Joel would kill her right then and there. However, there is a reason for Joel's actions.
Joel was in another accident a couple months ago and a girl was hurt. He's on probation right now. If the police find out about it...
They're not gonna find out about it.
Now, this is a good explanation for his initial response, and even him basically refusing to call for help before Tracy arrived. However, it does get a bit ridiculous when he knocks Chris out with a log. Cut to Ed taking Billy inside their home, and to probably a scene you would not expect in a movie called Pumpkinhead. Ed washes off Billy's face with a wet rag and begins to tell him the story from the beginning of the film.
All right, now, wait a minute. Once upon a time, there was this scruffy old man, and, you know, he was one of them yes and no kind of guys. Once upon a time, there was this old man. Yeah, all about this very, very special son.
Billy does respond, but dies only a few moments later. Lance Hendrickson sells the living shit out of this scene. He goes from trying to keep it together to devastated heartbreak to murderous rage in 30 seconds. Wow, it's almost like adequately establishing a relationship results in an emotional payoff that's actually earned. Imagine that! Steve arrives at the cabin and it's revealed that Joel locked Chris and Tracy in the closet, which is kinda overboard if you ask me. You could chalk it up to the fact that he thinks he killed Billy and how he's on probation, but still, this does seem like he's going a bit too far. Nothing horrible, mind you. Ed pulls up to Bunt's dad's house and asks about where to find an old woman. Mountain Man tells him that all she can do is take him straight to hell and to bury his boy. Bunt, however, decides to direct Ed to the old woman's house. When Ed arrives, we are treated to some top-quality set design. The room is bathed in the orange of the fire, like Ed is about to step into hell itself. The old woman, Haggis, tells Ed she can't raise the dead, but she can give him something else, but at a powerful price. She tells him to go to an old graveyard to dig up a body for her. This scene is excellent for a variety of different reasons. For one, Ed's knowledge of Pumpkinhead has been established since the opening, as not only did he himself see the monster, he grew up in the region and would have heard the tales. And given he's lived outside the village area for what is probably a good while, it's understandable as to why he wouldn't know where to find Haggis or even remember her name. The acting is also great, with Lance managing to convey a wide variety of emotions. And while the woman who plays Haggis is hamming it up a bit, she plays the role of a creepy witch very well.
What you want, Ed Hardy? Say. Say.
Ed arrives at the graveyard and sees a portion of the ground raised up, as if the earth is keeping the evil thing buried within it as far from it as possible. Ed digs it out and brings it back to Haggis. She explains that for every one of man's evils there is a demon, and that he brought her vengeance. And so begins the summoning of Pumpkinhead. It's a fantastically presented sequence. The great creature effects, the orange of the fire bathing the room mixed with the wind, lightning, and cicadas as Pumpkinhead begins to take form, makes for an outstanding visual. And we didn't need to ruin anything in order to get it. Imagine that! Ed begins driving home, clearly not trying to pass out, so he has to pull over. Billy then suddenly pops up and asks him what he did.
What'd you do, Daddy?
Clearly this is Ed's conscious, but it's a cool scene nonetheless, showing that a part of him regrets what he did. Maggie decides to go outside and Steve follows, telling Joel to do the right thing before cutting to Ed burying Billy next to his wife, saying that they're going to pay. Steve confronts Maggie and I guess tries to comfort her. Maggie has been pretty fucking useless this whole movie. Steve is then dragged up a tree by Pumpkinhead and Ed sees Pumpkinhead fucking Steve up, something fierce. I'm not sure if he feels the pain of the victim or the immense pleasure that Pumpkinhead feels when he brutalizes any poor sod that is marked. Joel finally comes to his senses and lets Chris and Tracy out of the closet.
Phrasing?
About time Joel did something good. They're lucky they're not zebras. Anyways, Chris and Joel go looking for Steve and they find his bloody headband hanging from a branch, like it was seemingly just left there. When they get back to the cabin, they get a nice surprise. Steve's mutilated body hanging upside down. While this is a neat image, it is kind of strange that none of the ladies heard any kind of noise on the roof. Maggie is then grabbed by the back of the head, even though Pumpkinhead's hand was clearly in front of her face. This is what we call a nitpick. A small issue that doesn't affect the story. Not something that has huge ramification and affects the plot or larger world. Just thought I'd let people know because apparently not many know what a nitpick is anymore. Ed then sees what Pumpkinhead does to Maggie. He cuts a crude crucifix into her forehead as if mocking the fact that she's a Christian, even giving a little smirk. I'll get into the personality of the monster later, but the small details they add give Pumpkinhead more personality than one might think. Ed goes back to Haggis's house. He wants her to call it off, but she tells him it can't be called off. Shouldn't it be well known that this is what happens when Pumpkinhead is summoned? After all, it's been a well-known fact for decades, possibly even centuries. You could attribute this to Ed living away from the village for so long and his parents trying to keep it a secret from him. After all, it's just a ghost story to the children at least. It's not a huge issue, mind you, given that Ed made the decision in a pretty short period of time, and part of him clearly regretting it. But there are still issues even if they are small. However, we do get some pretty great acting and foreshadowing from the scene.
You'll fail, Ed Harley. You'll fail and you'll die, too.
Then I'll die. Then I'll die.
And pay the final price.
Pumpkinhead continues to torture Maggie and then brag about how brutally he treated her before finally killing her. Kim faints and we finally get a full look at our monster, and it's a fantastic design. Granted, that's to be expected by special effects god Stan Winston, who also directed the film. I have seen people compare this to the Xenomorph, and there are some base similarities, but the monster couldn't be any more different from how they're represented, and even the design, there are only superficial similarities. The sounds of the cicadas every time Pumpkinhead appears also adds to not only the atmosphere, but gives Pumpkinhead an otherworldly presence. In fact, while we're on this subject, the strobing lights you'd think would be an issue, but no, they're really not. Probably because they're in the background and it's not pitch black. Combine that with the wind and lightning make Pumpkinhead into some kind of force. Not of nature, as he is unnatural by his existence. A malicious, savage demon that rejoices in human suffering, announcing his presence because he relishes in your fear. Joel goes to stab Pumpkinhead with a machete, because he's an idiot, I guess, and is knocked away before Kim is dragged off and then up a tree. And as we all know, what happens when things go up. Ed arrives at the cabin, which I'm guessing he found through Pumpkinhead. Otherwise, it's not really stated or shown how he knows where it is. He sees Maggie and Steve's bodies, fully taking in what he's done. Well, without all of the demontisms anyways. The rest of the gang go into a small village and beg for help. Obviously no one helps them, so they decide to try and steal a truck. Naturally, the owner doesn't take too kindly to this, and then, unfortunately, Pumpkinhead shows up. Then Ed shows up a few seconds later, how convenient, and shoots Pumpkinhead, putting him down. Joel walks up to him, then shoots him in the head, which is a smart move. However, Pumpkinhead was just playing dead, and then impales Joel on his gun. Despite not showing a lot of blood, the kill is pretty brutal. The dog from the man earlier bites Ed, and Pumpkinhead feels the pain. I'm sure you all know where this is going, but that's not a bad thing in the slightest. Chris and Tracy make their way to Bunt's house to beg for help. Obviously it's met with silence, but Bunt decides to try and help them, wanting to know if Pumpkinhead is real. He meets up with them and leads them to an old church to give some exposition. It's pretty much stuff we already know, however, we do get the origin of Pumpkinhead's name.
That's what it's called, because it comes from the old pumpkin patch graveyard.
Of course, he then shows up, prompting the characters to leave. Pumpkinhead, being a demon from hell, obviously doesn't really like holy things. They make it to their vehicles, only to find all but one dirt bike completely trash. Or so Chris thinks. It is a bit odd that Pumpkinhead just spawned out of nowhere to dangle the chain in front of Chris and laugh evilly about it. I think he dropped down from the tree? Not sure really, but it does manage to effectively characterize Pumpkinhead, which we will discuss later. Pumpkinhead then yeets Chris in spectacular fashion. I mean, he one-arms that shit. Outstanding. Bunt and Tracy run off before running into Ed, who takes them to his house. It's not too long after that Pumpkinhead shows up and knocks down the door with a mangled up but still alive Chris. And the fact that Pumpkinhead brought him here still alive adds to his personality. Speaking of, Pumpkinhead's personality is very simple, as you've probably guessed. He's sadistic, loves to torture you both physically and psychologically, and loves to give all his victims hope just to take it away from them. It fully informs us as to why he doesn't just kill all of them in quick succession. He's consistently portrayed to savor the pain and suffering he inflicts, and there's not really a whole lot anyone can do to stop him. It's kind of refreshing to see a consistent and intelligent antagonist for once. Don't get me wrong, it's nothing revolutionary, but it's damn effective. Pumpkinhead goes looking inside the house, and just when it looks like he's given up, it's a complete fake out, and just look at that grin. Did I mention the effects in this movie were awesome? Because they're really good. Ed scares Tracy off by looking and even acting more demonic. I sense some motherfucking themes here. Pumpkinhead drags Bunt out, still alive. Ed's flamethrower gets caught on a nail, causing him to stab himself. This, of course, also injures Pumpkinhead. We also see that much like how Ed is looking more demonic, Pumpkinhead is looking more human. In the face, anyways. Ed goes to his truck while Tracy torches Pumpkinhead, which obviously does nothing. Before he can kill Tracy, Ed shoots himself in the head, then stumbles from his truck and collapses on the ground. Of course he's not dead, so Tracy kills Ed, stopping Pumpkinhead. We end on Haggis burying a small, dried-up corpse, which is actually Ed, as it is wearing the necklace Billy gave him. Pumpkinhead is a very solid movie that holds up really well. While the characters outside of Ed aren't as interesting, they're not unsympathetic. It was very clearly an accident, and they did try everything they could. Chris looked for a phone in the shop, Steve stayed with Billy until Ed came back, and Tracy tried to call from the cabin, but Joel was the one who stopped her. Even Joel's reasons for doing so made sense. Well, at least up to a point. Locking your friends in a closet is kind of stretching it. But even Joel realizes his mistakes and isn't an unrepentant asshole. But let's be honest, as far as human characters go, Ed is the highlight. His motivations and knowledge of the monsters are clear and consistent. A man who spent his whole life in an isolated countryside with only his son by his side. When that's taken away, when the last thing in his life that gave him purpose is gone, what is there left? He has no family or friends to grieve with him, no one to help him through it. It's only him stewing in his grief, which can make a man do some pretty irrational things. Lance Hendrickson steals the show with a performance that one wouldn't expect to see in a movie called Pumpkinhead. And a good chunk of it is solely based on expressions and body language. The presentation is outstanding. As stated before, it was directed by Stan Winston, and he did a great job with the creature effects. But not enough props are given to the setting. The isolation in the deep forest where people are so cut off from society that the only thing even remotely modern are trucks and mailboxes. And even the trucks look to be older models when compared to the group's vehicles. This is amplified by the great lighting that gives off this haunting vibe, creating some great atmosphere. Another thing the movie does well is fucking themes. I get that themes are something that talentless hacks usually bring up to try and defend something really shitty, but unlike them, I can actually back up how the themes work. The whole theme of the film is revenge makes monsters out of us. It consumes us. Emphasized at the end when Pumpkinhead and Ed begin to look similar to one another, and that Ed's corpse will become the new body for Pumpkinhead. As Haggis said, it comes with a powerful price. Not just your soul, but your very being. And the thing that I personally appreciate about how revenge is handled in this movie, that the cycle can never be broken.
For each of man's evils, a special demon exists.
The want and desire for revenge is just a part of who we are. I know that's a bit pessimistic of me, but I'm a sucker for themes that reflect cold, hard reality. And the best part of this is not once do the themes and story conflict. Ed pays that powerful price. There's no Deus Ex Machina that calls off Pumpkinhead for good. Nothing about the story breaks or bends to fit the theme. It's nothing groundbreaking and really simple, but it's effective. Plus, I think after all of the slop spilling out of Hollywood these past few years, anything with even a base level of competence is a godsend. Pumpkinhead is a great example of don't judge a book by its cover, as gay as that sounds. Despite the name, the movie has a great monster, solid acting, and puts a lot of films that come out these days in terms of world building and consistency to absolute fucking shame. I recommend giving it at least one watch through. Before I go, time for some shout outs and self-promotion. Yarp is a great podcast with some funny and great people. I was on there twice and it was an absolute blast. Give them a sub and follow them on Patreon as well. On Twitch there's a great guy named Borp Prime. He's a wholesome dude and the world needs more wholesome. As for self-promotion, follow me on Twitter if you want to see how I can never seem to escape Ruby. And of course, if you can, donate to me on Patreon. I hope you all have a good day.